I have the pleasure of introducing our next presenter, Paul Elam. Paul is the Chief Strategy Officer for the Michigan Public Health Institute, and he is responsible for diversifying the Institute's portfolio to address cutting-edge issues that affect the health and well-being of our society. He brings a great wealth of knowledge and experience measuring racial and ethnic disproportionality, and believes that sound public policy analysis should include an examination of whether all people are being treated fairly and equitably. Paul has a long history here in the Lansing area. He has a doctorate in family and child ecology, a master's degree in criminal justice and urban study, and a bachelor's degree in criminal justice, all from Michigan State University. And I've had the opportunity to work with Paul in his various positions as well with Public Policy Associates and other organizations. So Paul, welcome, and the floor is yours. You should be able to share screen as well.
Thank you so much, Arnold. And can everyone hear me and see the slide that I'm projecting?
Yes, we're good.
Wonderful. And I believe we have an hour and a half. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. Well, we will dive right in. Again, thank you, Arnold, for the invitation. I want to take some time to engage us in a dialogue around culturally responsive policy and practice. And I've noted that the theme here is moving from practice to policy. And obviously, you all are in a position as legislative staff to inform policy. And as you do that work, really want to have a probably uncomfortable conversation for some, maybe not all of us, to talk about what it means to think about race and culture as you do your work every day. So let me start out a little bit about what I mean by culturally responsive policy and practice, introduce myself, and then we'll dive right into the conversation. So what might it look like to be culture responsive? How does that look like in your practice? And is being culturally responsive different than being culturally competent? A couple things I want us to think about. And then the second thing in terms of race, what if our institutions are intentionally designed to benefit one culture or race over others? Wonder about that for a couple minutes, thinking from a historical view. And could it be that they are set up and continue to impede our best intentions as individuals? I think a lot of times when we think about culture, race, practice, what we can do, we think about what we're doing as individuals at the interpersonal level. But some of us are called to work at higher levels where we think about issues from a structural level or systemic level, or even in our institutions. As we develop public policy and try to impact the world, our local conditions, our sectors, and ultimately children, youth, and families who live in society. And so I'm hoping today we will gain some knowledge and awareness around these questions that I've posed. And after our conversations today, it's my hope that you would leave here with maybe a different perspective, a new lens, as you think about your work, even on Monday, about how culture, race might need to be raised up a bit more to affect what we're seeing in our society and impact all of our citizens. So as Arnold mentioned, I'm Chief Strategy Officer at MPHI. We are a Michigan-based, nationally engaged nonprofit public health institute. We were established by the legislature over 30 years ago to work in partnership with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services now to provide capacity, seek federal funds to bring into our state, and really to be an innovative arm to state government. We believe that the creation of MPHI is an example of governmental innovation. Oftentimes, we know that the government doesn't have all the resources, all the capacity to do its work. And as we're all navigating this pandemic, MPHI has been a nonprofit partner that's doing a ton of work behind the scenes to support our state in the response. And so we've done that for almost 30 years, and on a day-to-day basis, I support our CEO in that effort. One of the projects that I've been working on probably the last 20 years has been focused on racial and ethnic disparities in the state. And so through that work, I've looked at public policy research and evaluation to help decision makers make better decisions. And what I've often found is that there are disparities that exist in pretty much every sector: housing, lending, workforce, criminal justice, you name it. Probably some of the policy areas you all focus on, if you went in with that lens to see if all of our citizens were actually being treated fairly, equitably, or if the outcomes were the same, you will see some deviation. There's a continuum of experiences that we experience as citizens here in Michigan, and that's been one of my focus areas as we think about solutions to improve the outcomes and improve public policy as we do our work. And so happy to be here with you today to talk a little bit about that work and how it might impact how you think about your work. So as I didn't know we were set up sort of in this frame, so I don't think, are we able to engage the participants, Arnold? Will they be able to speak, or is this sort of just lecture?
No, they have the ability in the chat or to raise their hand.
Okay, okay. Will they be able to unmute themselves or just type in the chat?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so if we do have the opportunity to speak, and I'm hoping we will, I'm just asking, as we're in Zoom, do the best you can, try to stay connected. If you speak, use an I statement. We want to speak for ourselves and our own experiences. Listen, one speaker at a time. I guess typically these are rules for when we're in a real Zoom meeting. If I say something or someone else says something, we just ask that you attack the problem and not the person if you want to respond. Typically, when we're in a dialogue circle, if people can move up, if they've not had an opportunity to share, I guess we can apply that in the chat, or move back if you're taking up too much space. We would appreciate that. And then make sure what's learned here leaves here. If you learn something that you never heard about, share it with a colleague. But if someone shares a personal story here, we would ask that you leave it here unless they give you permission to actually share their personal story. And then you might hear something that challenges your worldview, your perspective. And I'm intentionally doing some of these things because that is my goal, to have people leave conversations hearing something that's transformative that would cause them to rethink what they believe to be true. So turn to wonder. Ask yourself, is it possible that I really don't know everything? Is it possible that there's another perspective that might generate a better solution? And I think we're in the right space today to explore collectively. So I'll read this. I usually ask folks to read this, but since we're sort of on chat mode, I'll read it. And as we move into what I'm going to call a difficult conversation, I think one of the first goals is that we just listen. And this is a poem by Leo Buscaglia called Listen. And it says, when I ask you to listen to me and you start giving me advice, you have not done what I asked. When I ask you to listen to me and you begin to tell me why I shouldn't feel that way, you are trampling on my feelings. When I ask you to listen to me and you feel you have to do something to solve my problem, you have failed me, strange as that may seem. Listen. All I ask is that you listen. Don't talk or do, just hear me. And I can do for myself. I am not helpless, maybe discouraged and faltered, but not helpless. To think about the uncomfortable conversations. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about race and culture as another example of an uncomfortable conversation that I think Arnold invited me to come talk about. So this is a real quote. You didn't know Jefferson Davis said this in 1860. Jefferson Davis also became the president of the Confederacy. I never assumed that we all know our history. I wasn't a history major, so most of the content I receive around history comes from my own reading, because a lot of it was removed from K through 12 books and curriculum, at least in the public school system that I went to in Detroit. I went to Cass Tech, and as Arnold mentioned, went to Michigan State University. And oftentimes we didn't talk about race because it was an uncomfortable conversation because of the history of this society. But this quote stood out to me and said, "This government was not founded by Negroes for Negroes, but by white men for white men." And I think that comment, the legacy of the policies that were created by men in power, and even today, some of those comments still remain. I heard a comment this past week that some people believe we don't have racism in America, others feel that we do. I heard a presentation last week where a quote came up about our Native American citizens in the United States that said we should kill the Indian and save the man, basically get rid of the culture of natives and train and assimilate them to be more like us. These statements are powerful, and there's been some things that have been institutionalized through our structures, our systems, our policies that continue to reflect these thoughts, perpetuate these thoughts, even though as individuals, we might not even hold these thoughts anymore. And I think we need to think about this because communities are still impacted by a lot of our policies. When you think about redlining, when you think about access to lending, when you think about the ability to purchase a home and accumulate wealth, when you think about access to institutions of higher education, there's so many examples where I think we as people have tried to address these issues, but there's some things that have been baked in our policies, our structures, our systems, and ways of doing things that if we really want to do culture responsive work, advance racial equity, we need to think about multiple levels of racism and policy solutions to address those issues. We have created social systems that have been grounded in issues related to race, whether we talk about it or not. And our systems shape policy and contribute to disparities, whether they're intentional or unintentional. I know some of the policies were very intentional when we denied certain people access to benefits, Social Security benefits, GI Bill benefits, to mention housing and things like that. And as we've had these tough conversations, we've seen that the conversations around race and the responses are dynamic and ever changing. And so the race issues that we dealt with in the 1800s, in the early 1900s, are not the same issues that we're dealing with in 2021. But race is still a factor and is still very prevalent. I think we heard Senator Tim Scott and Vice President Kamala Harris comment on that just the past couple of weeks. They might not agree on the views that each other have about race, but they both articulated that race is important. It is still a factor, and we can't just sweep it under the rug and act like it does not exist in our society. And so I think we need to find a way to talk about this history, the issues that continue to plague our communities. As we continue to come to vote, we see that those perspectives show up pretty much every cycle, and our country is still very well divided. But we do have long-standing racialized practices, starting at the structural and policy level, that are impacting our social and economic structures in this society. And as staff, as the elected officials that you work for, I think it's incumbent upon us. It's the right thing to do. We can't say that we're authentic, that we're ethical, if we don't consider these issues and just ignore them. I also share this quote. Most folks have focused on the first sentence in this quote, but I like to focus on the second sentence. You know, we know injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If we don't deal with that, then injustice could show up at your doorstep one day, and we have a history of that. It will move depending on who the target of injustice is. We've had a history that shows that any group could particularly be targeted. But this second sentence says that we are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. This is our notion of being humans, that we're not living on islands, that we're all connected in some manner, and we're tied in a single garment of destiny, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I think the last 12 to 18 months have demonstrated to that in terms of a pandemic. None of us can escape this. Maybe we thought we could last it out, we could move to a isolated island, but the pandemic will find you there. And the injustice that we did in not paying attention to public health and investing in public health has now caught us all up in this experience, right? The looting that took place in communities due to civil unrest, concerns about issues of race in our community. Maybe some of us thought, I don't have to pay attention to that. But ask business owners in our urban communities who had nothing to do with the unrest, and their businesses were attacked and destroyed. They're caught up in how other people feel. The neighborhoods who's had their homes burned, they're caught up in issues of injustice, even though they were not a part of it. And so we're all impacted by injustice. I was reading a book a couple of weeks ago, and it talked about one community's response to a disagreement around issues of race during times of integration, where the public pool was only allowed for white residents to go in and use it. And I guess federal law said that you have to integrate that pool. And the community, the elected officials there decided they were going to shut the pool down rather than allowing integration to happen in that community. Everybody in that community was impacted due to that injustice. Rather than integrating, they shut it down. And so no one had access to that pool anymore. We're all impacted by injustice. And so I want us to think about that as we move forward in the conversation. And so my focus question, I always have a focus question for talks, is in light of the events that are currently overwhelming our nation, what is one thing that we need to better understand to improve the current conditions? I'll take a couple minutes if you want to put your thoughts in the chat, we'll look at it. Is there one thing that you think we need to better understand and improve the conditions that we're facing? Bob, thank you for putting that comment out there. 4-part series, Exterminate All the Brutes. And I see there's an instruction there. If you would like to speak, raise your hand and someone will unmute you. Thank you, Katie, for jumping out there. I appreciate it. More empathy. Understanding of long-standing inequalities that affect us as individuals. I believe that's Ethan. Modern day impact of historically racist policies. Yes, the legacy. I think a lot of us say that we've stopped doing a lot of things, and that is true, but there's legacy that continues. And I think we need to think about the different levels. I may have stopped, you may have stopped, our jobs may have required us to stop doing things, but if you really take a deep look at the structures, the systems, and the policies. We've not done a lot of work in dismantling those policies. Empathy. So I'll give others some time to chime in later on. I know this might be a tough conversation, and that's why I put it right out there. This is a tough conversation, but I believe if we're intentional, we can become comfortable having uncomfortable conversations. And that is a skill set that I think all of you need. We shouldn't just sit back and allow things to happen if we know that they're impacting people in an unjust manner. And so the next thing I wanted to sort of share was recall a difficult conversation you had recently, whether it be with a loved one, a friend, a coworker, someone you just disagreed with, and think about what happened. What was this conversation about? Who did you have it with? What did you say? What did they actually say? And then what was the outcome of the discussion? We won't get into small groups, but I love to do this in dyads and hear what people share. But what I often find is that if you go through this process and look at the outcome and make it a cyclical process, you actually become more strategic, more thoughtful, more creative in trying to think about solutions. You might have a tough conversation and say, wow, I really showed up. Person didn't respond to me well at all. They got defensive. I got defensive. And next thing I know, we're talking about something that really had nothing to do with the issue, right? And you can reflect on that and try again, being strategic to focus on the outcome that you're really trying to accomplish. And that takes time, it takes practice. And then I think there can become a science that you actually develop and apply it in any conversation. And this is a really good skill to have, knowing that you're engaged in this type of work on a daily basis. You're trying to win people's votes. You're trying to win them over to see your perspective. And there has to be some way to deal with that when pretty much there's always an opponent, right? And so wisdom, I do a lot of my thinking based on biblical perspectives, and I'm not sort of saying that's the right way. It's just my worldview. I put it out there. But the definition of wisdom is thinking about what happens after I do something. Wisdom seeks a solution beyond an action. So if I come to a situation and I'm trying to work on law, I'm trying to work on a new bill, I'm trying to work on winning the perspective of my colleague, I need to be laser focused on the outcome, not the process. If I always try to show up and act like I'm right, but the outcome is we never get anything done, then maybe wisdom tells me you shouldn't focus on you being right all the time. You should focus on what's going to lead to a better outcome. And once I understand how other people see the world and understand what moves them and what their passions are, then I can begin to work on having difficult conversations that ultimately lead to a better outcome. And that is one of the issues related to race. I think it's very uncomfortable if we stay focused on, I need to be right, I didn't participate in it, is that my focus? Or am I really focused on healing, trying to understand people's perspective, as you all put in the chat, being empathetic, listening. I see Bobby just put out there, understanding that we all bleed red, we're equal and important in our own way, deserving respect and personal safety, yes, acknowledging the humanity of one another, we can get somewhere as a society. And so it really starts with us. I've had the privilege of speaking with current elected officials, our emerging officials in the state, and now you all as staffers. And I think if we all get on the same page or try to move in the right direction, this is not impossible. It is not impossible, but it does take time. It does take intentionality. So we're 30 minutes in. Let me move forward. And I'm going to stop sharing and reshare really quickly because I don't think I enable audio, but I want the group to watch this 5-minute video. Okay, let me share again. And I think I can click share sound. Yep. Okay, can you confirm that you're seeing the right version of my screen?
Yeah, we're seeing the start of a video, unequal opportunity race.
Okay, and you only see the video, you don't see any notes, right?
Correct.
Okay, I'm going to hit play and let's watch this. And then I would like to hear some response from the group after this video. This is a historical video. I think it does a great job in talking about our history in the US. I've not seen anything that does a better job other than reading a book or a narrative, and we don't have time to do that. But watch the numbers there. Those numbers represent the actual year. And then the runners on the track represent people groups in the United States. And then there'll be some comments about what's going on as time progresses from year to year. And we'll take a minute to discuss this. I'm sharing this because there is a history that tells us we need to focus on race and culture. Are you able to see the video again?
Sure can. And it's kind of loud.
apologize for the technical difficulty. Hopefully you got the point. Again, this was shared. I know at the individual level, we might all have different experiences that may not align with the video. So some white men may not see themselves as being privileged or ahead of others. Some women might not see themselves as doing better than people of color. And your experience might not necessarily reflect that. And even some people of color might be doing better than their white counterparts, or African-American females might be doing better than some white women. And so those are individual level experiences that I think we tend to focus on. My intention here is to get us to think about the structural, systemic, and political and policy histories that have been set up in this society. And I think the video talked about policy issues and systemic issues that are real and true and in operation within our society. Some people are able to transcend those things, persevere those issues, overcome those issues. It does not mean that they are not still in play. And some people might have access to certain resources, but those resources still might not benefit them in the way that they would like to be benefited. So their outcomes might not be optimal outcomes. The point I want to make here, though, is there are things that are set up in society by race, by gender, by other social demographics that create unequal opportunities. And oftentimes we don't talk about those issues. We focus on the individuals, the families, the communities. And when we think about policy solutions, oftentimes our mental model, our worldview is one that blames individuals, families, and communities for their plight. And I would argue that we, as folks involved in public policy development, need to have a more holistic view, a more ecological view, where we see a bigger picture. Yes, individuals are responsible for their behaviors. Families are responsible for their behaviors, and even communities. But that's not the entire picture. We have institutions, we have systems, we have policies, and we have structures that are also contributing to many of the outcomes that we see amongst children, youth, and families and communities, and the conditions that our people grow up in and live in on a day-to-day basis. So let me stop here and see if there's at least one brave soul, I don't even know how many folks are on the call, who might want to unmute themselves, raise your hand, and maybe comment on the video. I can sit in silence for a couple minutes if you want to think. If I don't hear any volunteers, we'll move on. But I'm always interested in hearing others' perspectives around how we might see the world as we think about issues related to race and culture.
As I noted in the chat, if you have a comment or a thought, please raise your hand, and I'll be able to see that and unmute you. So use the raise hand feature.
We'll give it 30 more seconds, Arnold. Let me know if you see anyone.
And we have Katie.
Hello, hello. I thought the video was really, really interesting. I really enjoyed the animation, the way that it brings about the issue in a kind of easier way to understand it. I'm afraid that if I showed this still to some people I know, that they would still kind of deny it, but it's a really good tool to kind of help kind of develop and show the inequality.
Yeah, Katie, thanks for volunteering. I'll respond after everyone else sort of makes their comment. So I appreciate you sharing that and how you feel others might respond to it.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. It's a really cool little session. I appreciate all the work that's been put into it.
Mark?
Oh, it's actually Stacy. Sorry.
Oh, okay, Stacy.
I'll change my name. I apologize. But I have a question, Paul, on how we actually get there. You know, I love the video. We've been working in the House of Representatives on diversity inclusion. But it seems like everyone has a different viewpoint of what it means. And I mean that from a standpoint, too, of different cultures having a different idea of what that means. So how do we really look at this, and how do we actually get there? Is it just bringing awareness to people and people looking at it?
You know, I really love that question. There's a quote that I love. It says, "People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care." I share that often because I think everything we do starts with relationship, right? I think sometimes we come together around core values. So we're already there, we come together around food or issues, but I think relationships are so powerful. And I'm going to get to a conversation around worldview in a second. But I think we have to acknowledge we are different people. We do experience life differently. And this isn't about forcing someone to see the world the way I see it. It's about sharing something that I have experienced that might influence how you're able to see the world. And it does take time. I think it starts with, as I had the slide up earlier, are people willing to talk about the elephant in the room? Some people are, some people aren't. What is the elephant that you want to talk about? Some people might want to talk about your elephant, others might. But I think starting one-on-one with relationships has been my experience of working through these issues. Many of you may have been in meetings. I can talk to someone one-on-one and they will share with me authentically and tell me right in that meeting, I will never say this in a larger meeting. So that tells me there are other factors at play and why they choose to share in certain settings and not other settings. I know when we do sessions like this, there's 21 of you here with us today. When I break groups out into small groups of 4 to 5 people, people share a lot more around issues that are uncomfortable than groups of 20 to 50. It is how we connect as humans. And so I think you have to do some work with knowing who you're connecting with, trying to do it one-on-one, trying to share your experience, share your perspective. You know the legislative process. You can bring one family, one person in to provide testimony and influence an entire committee based on one story. In fact, most public policy is developed based on those stories. And so there's power in stories and relationships. And so to Katie's point, to your point, I think it's Stacy, yes, the video will be something that's new. It will cause discomfort, but if you share it in a way that's not attacking, that's not demeaning, it's just trying to share a full story. None of us has the full story. Get people to turn to wonder, is it possible? Could it be? Right? And so I'll take more questions in a minute, but I didn't, I've read a lot, but to see this video, and I was introduced to this over 10 years ago, and I share with people, there's some people say it does a great job. Some people say I never knew it. I've talked to colleagues who said they felt robbed. They've been working as professionals for 20, 30 years, and they didn't know the truth. They've asked for more reading. And so I think if we start with people's humanity and believe that we really are trying to do the best, we just have different perspectives. Our goal is to share more information, share data, share stories, whether it be anecdotal, trend data. I think the university is bringing you all together. We're in the business of sharing knowledge. And I think we have to have faith in the process that when you share knowledge and data and information with decision makers, they will use that information. That's been my experience. Arnold, would you have any other comments about, I think that was a wonderful question. How do you influence other folks?
Yeah, I appreciate Stacy's efforts that she's undertaking in the House. So at this point in time, I think we can move on.
Okay. Let me move to the next slide. So thank you for those two comments on the video. All right. So what do I mean by culturally responsive practice with a racial equity lens? It really just means the ability to learn from and relate respectfully to people from your own and other races and cultures. We're often comfortable relating respectfully to people who think the way we think. And I think that's what Stacy and Katie are bringing up. But as soon as we bring other people's perspectives in, other races, other cultures whose experiences don't align with ours, that causes a conflict. So what is it about the video that might cause a conflict? It's because it does not reflect my experience. That's often the issue. Or it's an experience I really don't want to talk about. And that's a part of humanity, right? But somehow, when I work for philanthropies, when I work for elected officials, when I work for the executive branch, and they all call us and ask for information, insight, research to help them make better decisions, do you think if there's a part of the elephant that we just never talk about that could provide some insight, some data, some perspective that would help them make a better decision, and we never bring that part to the table, are we really doing them justice? Are we doing our due diligence? There's always this piece that's just hanging out there, and we're wondering, why aren't we closing the disparity gaps? Why aren't we creating solutions for the most vulnerable populations, the hardest to reach communities? Because we don't reach out to them and connect with them. And so that is the challenge, to do culturally responsive work and focus on race. I've already talked about it's uncomfortable, but it's really thinking about learning and relating to difference. And sometimes we don't like difference. There's nothing delinquent or criminal around difference. The term deviant means moving away from the norm, but oftentimes we associate deviance with delinquent or wrong or bad. And that is because our pursuit of being comfortable and being in the norm is what we're pursuing. And so when we have deviation from the norm, we feel uncomfortable. We say we live in a multicultural society, but do we really acknowledge the cultures and the differences in that multicultural society? Or are we really trying to get everyone to assimilate to this norm? And that's what this work is about. And I think we have to be honest and authentic. At MPHI, we have core values that are intentional. One of them is authentic relationships. We believe people ought to be authentic and show up and share how they feel and what they believe. Oftentimes, that might not be a core value everywhere we go. If you feel this way, you shouldn't talk about it. You know, some of us were told concerning race, you don't talk about it. Be race blind. If you don't know everything about it, don't say anything about it, because you might hurt someone. You might say something you didn't intend to do. And we've been told all these things about race, and so that makes it even more uncomfortable. But if we really want to serve the multicultural societies that exist in our communities, how can we do that if we shy away from the conversations and minimize and not acknowledge their lived experiences? And so I think That's why we don't have the relationships we need to have these conversations. And it takes some courage and boldness to get there. So that's what we mean by that. And then I offer this quote to help me, even as a professional, when I show up every day. It's not always about my agenda. Are you focused on the folks who are most impacted at the end of the day? If I'm working on a policy issue, and maybe it's around welfare or employment or education, housing, and all of my needs are already met in that area, is it really ethical that I'm addressing my agenda, or should I be focused on the needs of the folks who are most impacted? And so a culturally responsive approach is laser focused on keeping those folks most impacted at the center. Are we reaching out to the folks who are most impacted before we make decisions? Do the folks who are at the table making the decisions have the diversity and lived experience of that community that's going to be most impacted? If not, we've got some work to do. Those voices, those experiences, those perspectives need to be brought to the table. Do we have a mechanism to do outreach to the communities where folks are most impacted? And not just outreach to say we did it, but do we listen and do we raise up those insights or recommendations when it makes sense to include in our policy? Do we look at that history, the context, the institutions, the systems, the structures that have been set up and have impacted people by race and culture? So it's not just a point in time analysis, it's sort of a historical analysis. We are people who live in time, and the legacy of decisions will impact communities. So decisions that you make today, and if they become law, they will impact this generation, the next generation, and the following generation, unless someone comes and dismantles it. And that's what we're living under right now, decisions that were made hundreds of years ago that continue to impact us today. And so it does take more time. It does take intentionality. It does take willingness to have uncomfortable conversations. But the goal and the belief is, at the end of the day, we will produce better outcomes. We will change conditions that need to be changed for the betterment of the folks who are counting on this when they voted for the elected officials that we often work for. And so this is a checklist that I would ask you to take with yourself. Think about racial disparity more often. We can't just say 80% of kids in Michigan graduate, 80% of folks are employed in Michigan. No, we need to disaggregate those numbers. Who is the 80%? Who is the 70%? Where do they live? What do they look like? And most importantly, and who are the 20 and 30% who are not employed, who are not graduating, who are not housed? Are we talking to that group? Do we understand their histories? Do we understand what's needed to improve that number? The racial and historical legacies that might be contributing to those outcomes, the institutional and interinstitutional aspects of structural racism that exist in our society. Are our teams built in a way to have these conversations, to do outreach? I appreciate the comments that were made earlier. You might not know how to go out and have that conversation, but if you think it's important to have it, then you can sit there in a meeting and say, we need somebody on our team who can take the lead in this piece, because this is important. Or maybe we need to get some training so that we are better prepared to have these conversations. What is the cultural competence of your team? I remember talking to a group at Michigan State right before or right after the Flint water crisis emerged in our community. And the question was, would you be ready to go into Flint and help that community? And some folks said they were, and many said they weren't, because they did not feel competent enough about the history of Flint, what those residents were dealing with. Would they respect the folks who were coming in from Michigan State based on their lived experience or lack of lived experience, common lived experience, their race, their other social demographics. And that was very telling to say that folks who were trained, well educated, had experience, did not feel confident based on the competency that they did not have about that particular community. We can all do better in that space. And then thinking about showing up, oftentimes we say we're the experts. Yeah, we have credentials, we have systems, we have resources, we can pull it all together, we can write. But oftentimes, if we're honest, our expertise comes from the community, the evaluands that allow us to come in and ask the questions and extract the knowledge and information. And so it's those same voices that have information. We just package it and share it. And so there is value, there is knowledge, there is resource in communities if we reach out and ask for it. So I'll move into this conversation around how do you see the world? And this follows up to some of the questions we asked earlier. You know, how do we do this? I think we first of all have to acknowledge that we are humans, we are people, we've been called and charged every day to do something to support community, to advance some policy cause, to understand an issue better. And in that process, we have different norms, different beliefs, different customs, different ways of being raised. And we should put that on the table. So I start with this image. This is a history lesson. We got 25 minutes. So I'll give a couple minutes for folks to guess. I don't even mind if you cheat. So use your cell phone or your computer. But does anyone know what this image is? I need the actual name of the image. Not a description. Most folks start telling me what they see in it, but there's a name for this image. So let's see, Arnold, if we have any history majors in the circle today. I think I showed up ready to interact with the group, Arnold, and I think they showed up ready for a lecture. I can lecture. I talk too much, you all. I'm trying to hear what you all are thinking.
So hard balance sometimes.
Right. Do we have one? My Google powers aren't strong enough. Okay, Katie. Okay, thanks, Bobby. But Ptolemy's geocentric model of the solar system. Okay, so it is the geocentric model. So I won't belabor us any longer. It's not. So what we need to know is there are multiple versions of the geocentric model. So this isn't, I think the one you've quoted, it's actually the illustration of the European depiction of the geocentric model. And it's actually the version from 1660. Okay. So if you look at geocentric models, you'll see that they evolve over time and different regions within the world have their perspective of the geocentric model. And it's basically, that's why I talk about worldview. You might have the Europeans in 1660 thought this is what the world looked like. The Africans in 1870 may have thought this is what the world looked like. Americans in the 1900s might believe this is what the world looks like. So it represents sort of our worldview. And I start the conversation here is because we should not assume
that we all see the world the same. In fact, the geocentric models that have been developed and shared confirm that we don't see the world the same way, right? And so we need to start there and say, hey, we've never saw the world the same way. Probably won't ever see the world the same way, but we need to acknowledge those differences. And so this depiction of the geocentric model of 1660 just says, at one time, the Europeans believed the solar system, our universe, revolved around the Earth instead of the sun. And because we lived on planet Earth, we defined everything around us from the perspective of our position in the universe. And so that's an example of geocentrism. We believed at one point everything evolved around the Earth based on our limited perspective at that point, our knowledge, our understanding. And this is why I'm so convinced, you all, that if we have conversations, if we move into the deep end of the pool, if we get beyond our discomfort, that we will evolve. And you know why? Because we no longer see the world this way, you all. We're not stuck in 1660. We know that everything does not evolve around the Earth. At one time, we believed the solar system, our universe, revolved around the Earth. But once we became aware of our true position in a universe, we began to realize the Earth is merely one of a million stars in the universe. And whatever privileged place in the universe we thought we occupied was just an artifact of our perception at that time. And so any issue that we're dealing with, if we continue to talk about it, continue to share knowledge, continue to share perspective, we already have history and evidence that our thinking evolves, and our thinking can evolve around issues of race if we spend time, intentional time, focusing on it, and we won't be stuck where we've been stuck for centuries. In fact, we've not been stuck. We continue to evolve, and we need to continue to do the work. There are other centrisms. So androcentrism, that men dominate in society, Eurocentrism, that Western thought dominates, or even New York or DC centrism. I joke and sort of say when we work with our colleagues on the West Coast that we always shift to East Coast time, you know, because we believe the East Coast is the dominant culture. Okay, and so just think about that. Think about how you acquired your worldview as a child. Where did you get it from? People you trusted, your parents, your guardians, your family members, because that's who you had access to. But as you grew up and you ventured outside of your own home, did your worldview start changing? Once you started listening to teachers, once you started reading, once you started exploring spaces beyond your own home, you started traveling, you started having conversations with other people. I hope no one on this call has the same worldview that they had when they were 3 years old. And so our culture, our worldview, which includes our values, our attitudes, our beliefs, the assumptions we make, are just one of many in the world. They're dynamic, they're ever changing, and they can be influenced. Our brains are malleable. Our thinking can be changed. That's why we engage people in unconscious bias training. We believe that you can identify bias and manage it and begin to change how you see things and ultimately change your behaviors. If we didn't believe in that, we wouldn't be engaging folks in unconscious bias training, and the brain research sort of supports that. So if we think about how we acquired our culture and worldview, add race to that, there is evidence that we can begin to shift that around any issue. You know, how you think about people who live in poverty, youth and families who grow up in abuse or neglect, people who rely on safety net programs, our beliefs in the need for early childhood education, you know, all of the policy issues. If we listen, debate, talk a little bit, you know, And I often say, think about it from your heart. Obviously, we might have alliances with our parties. That might not necessarily be how you personally feel. I think that debate's going on right now at the national level. You know, someone's speaking out from their own heart, but their heart and mind is not aligned with the party. And so is that right or wrong? I don't know. It's for you to answer, but I think that's someone saying, I don't see the world the way you all see the world. Okay. And then I think we need to think about, if you acknowledge that your worldview has changed since you've been 3 years old, what caused your worldview to change? Someone asked me the question earlier, well, how do we start the work? What caused your worldview to change? That's very powerful. If it caused you to change, then maybe you should employ that same approach in the work that you do. Someone convinced you that your parents didn't know everything. At one point, I thought my mother knew everything. She could not be wrong. And then at some point I said, my mother doesn't know everything. She got this one wrong. Okay. And so we have to constantly think about these issues to determine if we become stuck in our thinking, which could also be impacting how we view and engage with people, communities, institutions, and most importantly, how you do your work to support the development of public policy. And your worldview will impact how you perceive and engage with people. I'm almost done. The last thing I want to point out, and then wrap up with what I mean by culturally responsive policy, is that we do have cultural bias. That's another tough thing. There's so much complexity in what I'm sharing with you all. So we've talked about the history. We've talked a little bit about tough conversations. We've talked about how we see the world, and then there's bias. There's bias, and we can't get rid of bias. I'm not here to do a training on bias, but I at least want to acknowledge, in terms of race and culture, we have cultural bias as well. If you get some time, you can check out the honorshame.com website. I think this infographic does a great job in talking about our cultural vantage points, you know, what we believe typically from Eastern culture versus Western culture. Some of us are very hierarchical in our thinking. Some of us are not hierarchical. We think in terms of relationships. Some of us see time as task focused. Some of us see it as event focused, right? These are all different cultures that we are grown up in and we've been accustomed to. You know, some cultures tell folks, you honor people based on titles. Other cultures tell people you don't honor titles, everybody's equal. You know, that's disrespectful. Some cultures say never go into a meeting with someone and not deal with their humanity. Talk about how they've been doing, their families, have some coffee, have some tea before you get down to business. Other cultures say, don't waste people's time, get right down to business. What's right or wrong? I think we have to change our frame. It might not be right or wrong. It's different, and we need to acknowledge the cultural differences that we actually have. Yes, Cindy, that's the website, honorshame.com. Thank you. And so the reason I bring this up is because, you know, they argue here that we tend to judge other cultures according to our own cultural values. And that's fine when we share the same culture, but what happens when two different cultures come together and interact, and then we start using our own cultural values to judge others, to judge other communities, to judge other people's perspectives? When we think about the development of our public policy, are we using a deficit approach where one's right, one's wrong? Are we using a multicultural or difference approach where we have to acknowledge all the perspectives and try to come up with a solution that's more holistic, right? Day in and day out, I've been working with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, looking at child welfare, where we think about delinquency, abuse, neglect, and there's a law that says that we can call in and report someone if we believe that they are abusing or neglecting their child. Right? We've set up a resource for that. It's in law, and then anybody suspected of child abuse and neglect should get assigned for investigation if it meets that threshold. But what we found as we've analyzed those data, this is some of the disparity data that we like to look at. There are thousands of calls made annually, probably over 25% of the calls. There's no abuse or neglect taking place. What someone is doing is using their cultural vantage point, looking at someone's behavior and making a call and saying something's wrong with that family. Not based on what the law says, but based on their culture. Hey, I wasn't raised that way. I didn't feed my child that way. I didn't discipline my child that way. I didn't clothe my child that way. I didn't talk to my child that way. Something's wrong with that. And they call, and then, you know, our state staff show up, CPS, Child Protective Services, they look at it and they say, there's nothing wrong with this. That's an example of a cultural bias. And because of our own cultural biases, thousands of calls are made annually alleging abuse and neglect which don't meet the definitions of the child protection law. And those calls are made and we're wasting resources. And we see something that doesn't align with our own cultural vantage point and we determine something's wrong with it. So we have many cultures in our society. And if we think from an inclusive perspective, we're moving in the right direction. You know, in this infographic, as it relates to relationships, some cultures agree with equality versus hierarchy. Western culture is egalitarian. Everybody's equal regardless of age, status, or position. We're all buddies. But to Easterners, ignoring social distinctions is disrespectful and rude, and people should know their place in society. And so Eastern culture is stratified. The older people are more respected and admired. There's a social hierarchy, a status-based pecking order. And for Westerners, this perceived oppression limits people's freedoms and personal expression. Such inequality is injustice from their perspective. So concerning relationships, my cultural vantage point leans more to Eastern culture, and my wife's leans more to Western culture, which causes a conflict often, and we laugh about it. Like, I was raised, respect your elders. That's what my parents told me, the household. Is that right or wrong? My wife was raised, respect those who respect you. I've heard both of those statements. And so when we go out to eat, somebody disrespects us, I don't care how old they are. I know my wife's about to go in and I'm like, uh-oh, we're about to be in an uncomfortable situation because her culture says they disrespected her, she should address it. If it was an older person who sort of disrespected us, I'm sitting there feeling totally uncomfortable. Like, how can you speak to somebody like that? That's your elders. It's like, well, they didn't respect me. They need to hear about it. And I'm not going to tell my wife she was wrong. So I need to honor her culture. So how often do we run into situations where there's different perspectives and we might deem it as deviant or bad or use a deficit model because we're not using this culturally responsive approach that says I need to relate to people in a way that's respectful, even though they have different cultural backgrounds. That is our challenge. So as I wrap up, I think the challenge is to develop culturally responsive policy. We need to intentionally and explicitly emphasize the diversity that exists within the geographic regions that you are representing. Can't just be the dominant culture and the dominant perspective. By dominant in terms of numbers or whoever's in power at that point. I know it's easy for me to say that. I'm not working in politics. I think I'm talking about public policy and the challenge for us to do our work ethically and to reflect the constituents and the diversity of those constituents. It incorporates core values that underscores a commitment to diversity in all aspects of our work. And I worry, it's not just diversity, it's equity and inclusion. And so it's all three. And we all should be focused on developing our capacity to support that base. I use the term client here. I know we're talking about constituents, but whoever we're serving, we might need some development in those areas. And so in addition to our speaking and our writing and our research skills, we need to develop skills to engage with people who are different from ourselves. And there is some research, there is science, there is knowledge around that for folks who want to consume that information. And so how do you become more culture responsive? It is a journey. You don't get there overnight. I would never say someone's culturally proficient. I think we need to show up with cultural humility to acknowledge that there's always something that I can learn, but we should develop self-awareness. I've developed a self-assessment tool that we share with folks when they do our day-long workshop, and we talk about it. We fill it out. It looks at how do I engage with people? How does my team engage with people? How does my organization engage with people? Do we like where we are based on our response to these questions, or do we think we need to be doing better? And if so, how are we going to work on that over the next 12 months as an individual, as a team, as an organization? I can't assume that everybody appreciates the value of diverse views. I've been in different places where that's not supported, but I think I would challenge us to think about our mindset and the models we use and the frames we use. Do we like deficit, one's right, one's wrong, or do we like more of a holistic approach where we think about difference? I would challenge us that our values are not the right values. Can we think about others' perspectives and values and incorporate them? Are we biased in some ways? Do we preference people who show up with our values over others? And does that cause us to engage in behaviors and make decisions that contribute to disparate outcomes for the folks who don't have our values? Who gets promotions? Who gets great assignments? Who's invited to meetings? You know, do you embrace diversity, or do you just bring folks to the table who think the way you think? Acknowledging the strengths of other cultures, incorporating that culture into our practice, and then continuing to stay on the journey to learn. So I think I'll stop here. I've talked a lot. I think we have about 6 minutes left. Are there any questions from anyone that you would like to ask me, or any comments that you'd like to make about what you heard today?
If you have any questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you again. I'd certainly like to thank Paul for a thought-provoking presentation. Having been in these discussions for the last few years, both inside and outside of Michigan State University, they are indeed challenging, and they are not easy conversations, not easy to open ourselves up in the way these conversations call for. But hopefully we've learned a little bit here today about how to do that and about why it's important. Certainly as you go about your work as legislative staffers and with your bosses, meeting people from all areas of the state, interacting with people from all areas of the state and all kinds of different backgrounds. Appreciate the work that you do. Are there any questions, or does anyone have a thought before we close? Okay. With that then, Paul, I want to thank you very much for your work in this area. With this session and with others that I know you're doing. Paul is also engaged with our Michigan Political Leadership Program. So thank you for all that you do, and hopefully from this session. You might get a contact or two out of it as well, but we do thank you for all you do.
Oh, thank you for the invitation, Arnold. And as always, I appreciate the opportunity to engage in dialogue around these topics. So go green, and look forward to the next time we get together.
Appreciate you. And to our attendees, we'll take a break right now, and we'll be back at 1 o'clock. Join us at 1 o'clock for our first session that will involve a panel, including State Supreme Court Justice, to talk about their career ladders. And then after that is a session on the Redistricting Commission. So great afternoon presentations yet to come. We'll see you all at 1 o'clock. Thanks again.